Want to first of all, before we move on to our speaker and an introduction, is to, if we can real loudly thank the kitchen staff. They did a great job this morning. That's great. We said it was about 22 months ago that we were able to do this, so we're glad to be back and have them here cooking good stuff for us. I'm going to call Keith up to introduce our speaker this morning. So Keith, thanks.
I'm thinking this thing is not on. Can you guys hear me?
It's on. Yeah, it happens to me all the time when I do this.
Let Aaron take care of it. How's that?
That's good.
That's better?
Yeah. All right.
Hey, guys. I have the distinct honor of introducing our speaker, Kevin Latty. I found out about that honor 10 minutes ago. Thank you, Pat Morgan. but truly, it is an honor. Kevin is a longtime resident of Dunwoody. Kevin has been a financial advisor for 39 years now. And you'll see some other things about Kevin up there. But from my perspective, the most important thing is that Kevin is the founder of Souly Business, and that's how I know Kevin. And I just want you to know, I will be eternally grateful to Kevin Latty, eternally grateful for his obedience to the Lord in founding Souly Business. And you'll hear more about that. I first went to Souly Business in 2017 after having been invited 7 times. 7 times I said no. I always found an excuse not to go. And finally decided, almost out of a sense of obligation to the guy inviting me, he's like, oh gosh, I guess I should just go. And I'll never forget that morning driving to the retreat, which was about an hour, 45 minutes from Dunwoody. Driving over there, every exit I came to on the interstate, I thought, I could just turn off and turn around and just get back home. And why do I really need to go to this? And I was thinking, why can't it just be like a breakfast? Why does it have to be a whole weekend? Why can't it just be like a breakfast meeting? But I went. And I tell you what, guys, Souly Business has had the most profound impact on my relationship with God of any other experience in my life. Every aspect of my life has changed since going to Souly Business in 2017. And I have been now 7 times. So I said no 7 times. I've been 7 times, and I'll be going an 8th in February. So Kevin, I am just eternally grateful to you and all that you have done through this ministry and your obedience. So without further ado, let me welcome my dear friend, Kevin Latty.
All right. Good morning, guys. Am I hot?
You might have to click it on. Whichever way it is, you might have to just have to go down.
Or could I just use
You
this?
didn't use that one too?
No, maybe I'll click it on since I already have it.
It's on the top.
How's that?
That's
Better?
good.
Good.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, it's good to be with you guys this morning. When Pat called me several months ago and asked me if I'd be willing to share with you guys this morning, honestly, my first thought was, well, why me? There's nothing particularly interesting or certainly any more compelling to my story than for many of yours. But then it just kind of hit me. God said, there you go again, Kevin, making it about you. He said, it's not about you, it's about me. And it's about what I have done through you and what I'm able to do through anybody who just makes themselves available to me. So it kind of reminds me a little bit in this season of Advent of the Virgin Mary's response when she was approached by the angel Gabriel, who said, I have something very important that I want to do through you. And her response was, well, I am the Lord's servant, and may it be to me as you say. So I'll just share with you guys a little bit about my story, and then tie that into Souly Business, two stories are very much connected to one another. As Keith said, I am a longtime resident of the Sandy Springs Dunwoody community. In fact, I'm your neighbor. I live about 2 miles from here in the River Oaks subdivision right off Spalding Drive. We've been there for about 20 years. 53 years ago, my family, when I was 10 years old, moved to Hunt Cliff over here where Cherokee Golf Course is. My dad was a member of Cherokee. And so that was in 1968, which was a trip out to the country from Buckhead, where I lived prior to that time. Went to North Springs High School, graduated in 1975. So I've been around here a while. As far as my story, just my growing up years, I grew up in what I would say was a very hyper disciplined, somewhat harsh environment. You know, my dad was just pretty tough on all of us as kids. And honestly, the predominant message that I received from home growing up was that you were only as good or as bad as your most recent achievement or failure. So that was kind of the message that was programmed into me as a young child. I was fortunate as a young child, I'm talking elementary school age, in that I was maybe slightly better than average student, maybe slightly better than average athlete, and I made friends easily. I was the star running back for the Sandy Springs Saints in 1969 and 1970. I think I was president of my 4th, 5th, and 6th grade class. So things were going pretty well for me. But a sad but true fact of my life is that I peaked academically, athletically, and socially in the 7th grade. Now that was a great year, but that's when I hit my peak. And you know, I usually get a little bit of a chuckle out of that, but it is very, very true. When I turned about 13 years old, my dad really turned the screws down on me, and like a lot of teenagers, I rebelled, and we'll just say that I walked down a less than admirable path in my teenage years. And my dad, following my graduation from North Springs High School, followed through on a long-held threat that he was going to kick me out of the house when I was 18 years old. So I found myself at 18 living out on my own. I was very fortunate that I had a job. I'd started working at a grocery store my senior year of high school. So I had a job. In fact, I worked in the produce department at what is now the Publix, right over here behind the church. It was called Colonial Stores at the time. And so I worked hard and set my sights on becoming the manager of the produce department in this large grocery store. And so by age 20, I had been promoted to produce manager. I had 2 or 3 people on the produce staff working for me. We had over 100 stores in the Atlanta division. I was always in the top 5 or 10%, you know, with respect to the metrics by which they judged us as produce managers. So as a 20-year-old, I was starting to get back a little bit of that respect and admiration that I had had as a young child, and that I so desperately needed. I was also attending night classes at Georgia State University while working full time. So it wasn't the typical college experience, but it wasn't bad either, because I was making, you know, good money I had a Datsun 240Z, a boat up at Lake Lanier, and plenty of cashiers from the grocery store who were always willing to, take a day trip with me up to Lake Lanier. So it really wasn't bad. As I was approaching graduation from Georgia State University, I don't think I really asked myself, what do I really want to do? But I think the question I asked myself was, what can I do that would impress others by what I do? And so I thought, well, what can be more impressive to the world than becoming a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force? So I applied to officer training school, got accepted, went off to officer training in San Antonio, Texas, graduated as a distinguished graduate, and went off to pilot training, jet training in Columbus, Mississippi. And all I can tell you guys is that for me, the wheels just kind of came off. I didn't have the hand-eye coordination, the reactions that were required to fly jets. I was never comfortable in the cockpit, and I quit. They called it SIE, self-initiated elimination. And I came back to Atlanta with my tail between my legs, very embarrassed and humiliated. And so I had kind of become that failure again that I had been in my teenage years. As my dad said, you'll never amount to anything. And so I just, asked, well, okay, so what am I going to do now? And I just wanted to get out of town, honestly. So I moved down to Tampa, Florida, and was able to get a job with a Wall Street firm. Some of you guys may remember the name Dean Witter. I went to work for Dean Witter Reynolds as an account executive in 1983. And I went to work with this steely resolve that I will never fail at anything again in my life, and I will never suffer the embarrassment and humiliation that I just experienced in the Air Force. And sure enough, I got off to a fast start, and I became one of the top producers in my training class. And so, here I was kind of on this roller coaster of life, everything just hinged upon my latest success or my latest failure. So I was kind of getting that game back again. It's what I desperately needed, was your success and approval and admiration through my achievements and accomplishments. And you might ask, well, so where was God in this? Well, to my awareness, God was not a part of my story up to that point in my life. It was all about me, and it was all up to me. And in actually with the holiday season of 1986, so it would have been just exactly 35 years ago, I started going out with this young woman. Her name was Denise. And I just knew that Denise she was kind of weird, this Christian person, she was into this cult thing called Young Life, just kind of weird stuff, but anyway, we were out to dinner one night, and I was just kind of being a jerk, being sarcastic, needling her. And I said, so Denise, so what's this bit about Jesus dying for my sins? And when I asked her that question, Denise took that question very seriously. And she excused herself from the table. She went to the ladies' room and she prayed for me. And she came back to the table and she very articulately laid out the gospel for me. And I didn't drop to my knees and ask Christ into my life at that moment. But Denise shared with me the story of a heavenly Father I had who loved me unconditionally, didn't have to make straight A's, didn't have to run touchdowns, didn't have to fly jets. All I had to do was rest in who I was in him and in my relationship with him. And honestly, that was a very compelling message, because I was 29 years old and I was worn out from trying to prove my worth to the world through my success and achievements. And Denise bought me this beautiful Bible that I still have to this day, wrote me a beautiful note in it. And over the next several months, I would come home from work, and just God was just drawing me to his word. And I can't tell you the date, but it was sometime in the spring of 1987. I was going for a run on Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa, Florida. And that's when I just surrendered and said, God, if you are who you say you are, then I'm in. And, so that's my story of coming to Christ. I ended up meeting Anne, my wife, about 6 months later. God had brought Denise into my life for a purpose. But 6 months after that, I met Anne, who's from New England. And we ended up moving up to the Atlanta area. We joined Mount Vernon Presbyterian Church right up the road, and really began to grow in our faith among a community of Christ followers at Mount Vernon. There were a couple of events in the 90s that would be real earmarks for me in terms of my spiritual growth. One was that at Mount Vernon Presbyterian, we had an annual church family retreat. And at this retreat, they would always do they called it the Christ Walk, which was a dramatization of Jesus's life. And one of the matriarchs of the church asked me if I would be Jesus in this Christ Walk. Well, I'd been the year before, and this guy who was Jesus, he was like, reading all his lines and everything. I thought, I need a better Jesus than that. So I actually memorized most of Jesus's words from the book of Mark. And the Christ Walk was from the baptism and calling of the disciples all the way through the crucifixion and resurrection. So memorizing those words of Jesus through one of the Gospels was quite impactful for me in my faith journey. The other thing that happened was that back in 1997, I was invited by a guy I barely knew to a Walk to Emmaus retreat, which, how many of you guys have been on Emmaus, which of course comes out of the Methodist Church. And I was just blown away by that. Became pretty involved with North Georgia Walk to Emmaus, served on a number of teams in the late 90s and early 2000s, and was just kind of always blown away by the people I met. Who said, I've been a Jesus follower for 20 years, and then I went on my walk to Emmaus, and it was a transformational experience for them. And it was very much that for me as well. And back in 2002, I was serving on an Emmaus team, and I met a guy named Larry Green. And God had just birthed in us a very similar vision to take some of the core elements from the Emmaus playbook and start a new ministry. And the core elements are, having a host team, serving a group of first-time people, having speakers with table discussions, all wrapped in great fellowship and music and good food. So Souly Business was not an original idea, so to speak. I don't think I've ever had an original idea, but we took some of the elements, as I said, from that Emmaus playbook and started Souly Business. When people ask me, why is it that, God led me to be a part of starting up that ministry. I like to refer to a quote or a paraphrase from Henry David Thoreau. He said that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And that really resonated with me because I was one of those men. In fact, I'm not sure if it's the mass of men, but I think it's all men. It's kind of like, where are we on that continuum? Are we a little desperate or a lot desperate? And so Souly Business was birthed to create an experience that through an intimate relationship with Jesus, men might become a little bit less desperate. So that's how the ministry got started. We hosted our first retreat back in 2003. It was United Methodist Camp Glisten up outside of Dahlonega, Georgia. And a few guys showed up and said, well, why don't we do that again? So we did. And ultimately, here we are 19 years later. I have no idea how many Souly Business retreats we have hosted. We typically do 3 or 4 a year now. We have not done one in the last couple of years because of COVID. But God has just kept his hand on the ministry. It's his ministry. It's not our ministry. It's his. And over the years, the Lord has seemed to bring men to Souly Business from other parts of the country and other countries who have started Souly Business chapters in other states around the U.S. We're in Canada. We are in Costa Rica. We're launching a chapter in Guatemala this year. So we're just kind of along for the ride. I'll share with you, briefly a little bit about, so what happens on a Souly Business retreat. After Larry and I, got together, it really wasn't hard for us to come up with, what are the topics that we as businessmen, as husbands, as fathers, as members of our churches and community, what are those issues that we really struggle with? And so those were our top topics, rooted in our own challenges. And so I'll just give you kind of a brief overview of the topics, talk topics on a Souly Business retreat. The first one is faith and work. It's just this notion of faith and work. Well, do they really mix? And that's a topic that certainly resonated with me because I literally spent half my time running a financial advisory practice and half my time with the ministry. And there's this what creeps in is this notion that somehow my business is secular, but the ministry is sacred. And that's not right. From God's perspective, it's all sacred, right? And so why is it then that I struggle with that? And why is it that, if I'm talking to a client, particularly a client who I know not to be a Christ follower, it's really hard for me to introduce my faith into that conversation. Yet on my next phone call, I'm talking to somebody about the next Souly Business retreat, and it's the most natural thing in the world. So we have a topic on faith and work, and do they mix? We have another talk on priority. That as guys, how do we order our priorities in a way that honors God and honors our families, honors who we are in the marketplace? And I read this to introduce this talk on Souly Business retreats. I thought it right, maybe I did. No, I didn't. So Ron, I have an excerpt from my wife's journal going back about 25 years. And in this journal, she is just pouring out her heart to God about me and my misplaced priorities. And it is just a prayer for me that I would begin to align my priorities in a way that honors him and honors our family. And that's probably, I think, maybe for a lot of us, my wife still journals, and sometimes I'm looking over like, she's writing about me today. But so we have a talk on priority, and how do we order those priorities in our life? We have a talk on our identity, and I think as men, we maybe I should say we like to speak in first person at Souly Business, so I should say I. Why is it that I get my sense of identity so often from what I do rather than who I am? And I don't know, maybe some of you guys are low handicap or scratch golfers. Is that your identity? Does your identity lie in your business or in your kids? I mean, those are all things that are temporal at best, and there's only one identity that is eternal, and that is who we are as beloved sons of the King. So we have a talk and discussions on identity. We have a talk on servant leadership, and what does it really mean? What does it really look like to lead through serving others? It's kind of an inversion of the typical paradigm. So what is servant leadership? How do we do it? Or more importantly, why do we do it? We do it because it's rooted in love. And, sometimes, again, my observation of myself is, well, I try to be a strong servant leader when it comes to my business and comes to the ministry. But sometimes I fall real short when it comes to being a servant leader in my home. And if I'm trying to be a servant leader in my business, but I'm not leading my family that way, that kind of makes me a little bit of a fraud, because it makes my attempts at service leadership in the marketplace to be a little bit self-serving. So we have a talk on servant leadership. We have a talk on the cross, and what we're really getting into there is, so what are those things that stand as obstacles between me and that abundant life that Jesus talked about in John 10:10? What are those obstacles to God's grace in my life? For me, is it fear? Is it greed? Is it anger? Is it guilt? Is it shame? Well, those are the things that God died for. And so we have a talk on the cross, and a very meaningful worship service after that talk on the cross. This is all on Saturday evening. And then on Sunday morning, we have a talk on the resurrection. Well, what does it mean? What does it look like, to live our lives beyond the cross in response to God's grace? It's, my observation is that in the Christian community, oftentimes we just get half a gospel. We get the cross, we get the forgiveness of sins, we get the forgiveness of sins, but we forget that the cross was really a means to an end. Right? I don't think God just desired a bunch of forgiven sinners. He wanted saints who would allow him to live his life through us. And that's that message of the resurrection that comes through on Sunday morning at Souly Business. What does it really look like to allow God to live his life in and through me? And then our final talk on the weekend is a talk on finishing well. Finishing well, which I always hasten to point out to guys who were in their 20s and 30s that, hey, guys, this talk is for you as much as it is for those of us in our 60s and 70s and beyond, because none of us have been promised tomorrow. For my wife Ann and I, this notion of finishing well, has been kind of front and center with our conversations recently, and I'll share with you a conversation that we had not too long ago that really caused me to really think a lot deeper about, well, what does finishing well look like for me? And so Ann and I were having this conversation as empty nesters, and we were talking about this, this next season of our life, maybe the final 25% or third of our life. And so what does finishing well look like? And what are we going to do? What are we going to say yes to? What are we going to say no to? And then the conversation kind of rolled around to, well, why? The why question is always a great question to ask. Why are we going to do what we do in this season of our life? And so, Ann asked me, well, why will you do what you do? And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, well, honey, I guess at the end of the day, I just want to know that my life mattered. And I said, well, how about you? Why do you do what you do? And she thought about it for a moment. She said, well, I guess because I just want other people to know that their lives matter. All right, there you have it. Here again, I'm making it about me, right? And so I share that with you because I think for us, for all of us, that this notion of finishing well maybe has something to do with letting other people know that their lives matter. So that's kind of a rundown on what happens at a Souly Business Retreat. What is it that makes the experience certainly not unique, but I would say exceptional? It's really the environment. In fact, I just told you about all of the topics that we discussed, but probably a week after a Souly Business Retreat, if I were to go to most of the men there and say, do you remember the 3 points from the identity talk? They wouldn't remember that. But what they do remember is how they were made to feel on a Souly Business Retreat. And by having a group of 100 men serving them, preparing their meals, just, loving them, listening to them. That's part of it. It's really the experience more than the content, I think, that makes Souly Business what it is, as well with all of our speakers and we call them table listeners around the table. There's an openness, there's a transparency, there's a vulnerability to the men there. It's so refreshing. And when our leaders and speakers and table listeners are open and transparent and vulnerable, that gives the men there permission to be open and transparent and vulnerable as well. And that's when I think the Lord can really work. When I recruit speakers for a Souly Business Retreat, and many of our speakers are very accomplished men in the marketplace, maybe a senior vice president from Chick-fil-A, but this guy will get up and he will talk more about his failures and his challenges than his successes, or it's not a how-to talk. In fact, when I recruit a speaker, my instructions are very simple to them. So I don't want a sermon. Okay. I want to hear your story. I just want to hear your story. And I want you to, as best you can, tie your story to the topic. So it's really men sharing their stories. It's just a huge part of the weekend. Yeah, so that's kind of it. I think my time is about up here. I mean, if there's any questions, one other thing is we don't really market Souly Business. We don't have a marketing budget. Our marketing budget is zero. Men come to a Souly business retreat because another man invited them to come. So to that end, I would like to invite any of you guys to come join us. As Keith said, our next retreat is in February. It's February 4th through 6th. It's at Strong Rock Camp up in the North Georgia mountains. We typically host 3 or 4 a year, always same time. The calendar, it's always the weekend before the Super Bowl. We're very mindful of our calendar in that regard. So it's the weekend before the Super Bowl. We host a retreat every year, the final weekend in April. We host a retreat the final weekend in August, which is the weekend before college football starts. And we will typically host a weekend, the retreat the 3rd weekend in October, which by God's grace always seems to fall on a Georgia bye week. So that's when we do the retreats. And a lot of guys go to Souly business retreats in other states and countries, which is always a fun experience as well. So yeah, love for you to come. It's $199. If $199 is a problem, we'll cover your fee. So we never want that to be an obstacle for anybody. So thank you for allowing me to share. I'd be happy if you have any questions. Happy to answer them for you.
I've got a question, maybe a couple, but that first retreat, how many people did you have then? And was there a plan then for 3 or 4 retreats a year?
No, it was a plan to do a retreat. And it was pretty easy for me to put together the first host team because I was able to call on a bunch of men who I had come to know through the Walk to Emmaus ministry. But we had 24 we call them first-time brothers. We had 6 tables with 4 each, and it took me about a year of hard work to fill 24 empty chairs for the first-time guys. So yeah, that was back in September of 2003, and God showed up for that. Let's do another one. So I think we did 2 in 2004, and then probably moved to 3 in 2005. So yeah.
How'd you do with working faith and conversations with your financial advisor and clients, and bringing business together?
You know, I mean, that's been another. It's been kind of an amazing story when I reflect back on God's provision in my life and in my business. When Larry and I met in 2002, my business was not in a great place. This was in the post-technology meltdown. It was post 9/11. The market was in the tank. You know, my business had taken a hit. And like, okay, now God's calling me to basically, you know, start working part-time in my business and, you know, the other half of my time devoting to starting up this ministry. And I was like, God, I can't do that. I've got young kids. And, but somehow, I stepped out and said, all right, I'll trust you. and God's provision over the last 20 years, it just kind of blows my mind. And to your question, integrating faith into my business, it seems that most of probably 95% of my clients are Christ followers now. And so much of my business growth has actually come through the ministry, even though I would never initiate a conversation with anybody I met through the ministry about what I do professionally, because it would call into question my motivation for doing the ministry work. But having said that, people, they just know what I do, and God has brought to me people over the last 20 years that has given me an advisory practice that is just unbelievable in terms of the relationships I have, the way we're able to see our financial resources, a matter of stewardship versus ownership. It's been an amazing thing to see how God has just kind of kept his hand on my advisory practices as well as the ministry over the years. So it's kind of like he said, you take, Kevin, I'm calling you to do this and I'll take care of that. So it's been, it just blows my mind to this day. Yeah. Thank you. Well, we have not hosted a retreat since January of 2020, right before, everything hit with COVID. So it feels like we're almost not in a startup mode, but in some sense, we've lost, just some of the continuity that we had enjoyed for many years. And that goes for our chapters as well. So we're having a Zoom call with all of our chapter leaders across the country and internationally, actually next week. So the prayers would be around just that we can kind of get the gears turning again and pick up where we left off with minimal hiccups. So thanks for the question.
Kevin, between the business and Souly business, I guess how old were your kids when you started the Souly business? And did it ever did you ever have a priorities discussion, priorities issue then between family and all these other commitments?
When we started Souly business, my two sons were 9 and 12. And this is another story that, we lived over in the North Springs subdivision, and I because of my hard wiring into my identity and how people saw me and everything, we had like, okay, now it's time to move to a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood, join Dunwoody Country Club and put the kids in private school. And that was in 2000. No sooner did we make those decisions than the market just tanked. I mean, it was like ring a bell. It's the top of the market. Kevin's made all these dumb decisions, and I mean, it was a very, very stressful period of my life. But again, it was just a matter of getting up and putting one foot in front of the other and trusting God, and some of his provision even through that. There was a time, I think it was in 2001 or 2, when, even, making the tuition payments at Holy Innocents was, it was a real challenge. It was never a question of, were we going to put food on the table? But I remember my brother-in-law up in Boston, just wrote us a check to cover a year's tuition. In closing, the first thing he says was, "Thank you for allowing us to do this." I'm like, "What do you mean, thank you for allowing us to do this for you?" But even that, was transformational for me, because it helped me to understand, the joy of giving, and the way that has played out, for us over the years in terms of understanding generosity and the joy of giving. And that we have to have those who are willing to gracefully receive in order to give and experience the joy of giving. It's just, sure I answered your question, but it was a pretty challenging period back then.
Yeah, how many people have gone through the program, and how many chapters do you have?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I don't know how many people. It's certainly been thousands. But we have a chapter, Georgia, Johnson City, Tennessee, Central North Carolina. We have a chapter in formation up in West Virginia. We have a chapter in California, Southern California. We have a chapter in Ottawa, Canada. We have a chapter in Costa Rica. We have a chapter launching in Guatemala this year, potentially a chapter in Africa. I think it's Rwanda, actually. No, Uganda. And we don't have a goal to grow the ministry and to plant chapters. We just want to be able to respond with excellence when men come to a Souly business retreat from wherever. And over the years, that's happened, and men have come and they said, this is awesome. Can we do this in North Carolina? And we're pretty selective and discerning with respect to chapter leaders. Do they want to do it for the right reasons? Are they well respected and well connected in their communities? And if so, we'll just partner with them and help them launch a chapter. But I don't know how many men it's been over the years. It's been a lot. Sure.
You spoke to that first year where you had 4 men around the table. Have you kept with that number and the intimacy of that, or has it changed? Or is it now?
Well, the number of men on a retreat has grown. Now the total retreat number is about 200. It's 100 host team participants and 100 first timers. But as far as around the table, we will typically have 5 first-time brothers, we call them. We'll have 2 table listeners, they're just facilitators. And then we'll have another table servant who's typically a first-time host team member they've got an apron on and they are just waiting on the men at their tables. The idea that they're just embodying, the hands and feet of Jesus and serving these men on the weekend. But yeah, we keep the tables to 5 first timers and 3 host team participants.
Talk a little bit about your dad and kind of the impact he had. I'm curious, after Tampa, right, coming back to kind of relationship with Christ, did any of that change for you? Then how did that impact for how you so far?
Well, again, thank you for asking that question, because my dad is 96. He turned 96 last Friday. And I have spent the last 50 years pursuing a relationship with my dad. And we have, he's not a Christ follower. It's so, still praying for him. But we have a really good relationship. And a part of my story is a story of just forgiving my dad and honoring my dad. He's a World War II veteran, and he loved the way that I honor my dad is he flew 30 bombing missions in a B-24 over Nazi Germany. And he loves to relive the war years. I mean, he was down over Thanksgiving, and I found this big hardcover book about the 44th Bomb Group. And there were actually stories about his crew in this book. And so we're reading that together. I took him and my son over to England a few years ago. We, visited the airfield that he flew missions off of. There's a private flying club that flies off of the remnants of the runways. And I had a pilot take him up, and they were doing touch and goes off the same runways that they had flown their missions from at that time 75 years earlier. Took him down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida a few years ago to take a 30-minute flight on the only remaining operational B-24 in existence. So it's a part of my story. It's just continuing to pursue and honor my dad. And I think I've done that. And I think that if you were to ask my father, do you feel loved and honored by your son, Kevin? He would say, absolutely. So Took me a while to get there. All right, guys. Well, thanks for allowing me to share some of my story with you, and would hope to see you guys on a retreat at some point.
Kevin, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for that inspiration. Thank you so much for all you do for all us Christ followers, for those who need Christ in their life. It's a true honor to have you here today. And, thank you for the example you just talked about, pursuing your dad and honoring your dad. We all have dads, and I'll follow that example. And I hope y'all will consider Kevin's offer to attend Souly Business. It's a heartfelt offer. And, it's always open. So thank y'all very much for being here. Thanks for our first time visitors. We hope we'll see you back again next Tuesday and every Tuesday after this. We're going to close the prayer. So y'all bow your heads. Lord God, we thank you for your servant Kevin. For all he does, for the way you have touched his life, for the way you introduced yourself to him, and the way he's able to share that with people. Lord God, help us all integrate you into our lives, in every aspect of our lives, so that no corner left untouched or unblessed. Lord God, help us take your message out in the world, be your servants to reach others in Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
So, you know, you say that
Thank you.